mining of Bitcoin globally is now using up enough electricity to power a country the equivalent size of the UAE. What's more, it's growing. But amid the warnings of the impact on climate change, this trend can also be seen as an indicator for how the broader increase in digitalisation will challenge how we utilise energy resources in the future. You're listening to the Business Extra podcast coming from the National in Abu Dhabi. I'm Mustafa Alrawi, Assistant Editor-in-Chief. Before we begin, please do subscribe to this show or any of the National's other podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio content. With me is my co-host, Kelsey Warner, the National's Future Editor. Hi, Kelsey.
Hey, Mustafa.
So the premise for this discussion today about Bitcoin and energy use is an article you wrote for The National, which you can see at thenationalnews.com, about the increasing energy demand that people who mine Bitcoin, as opposed to people who trade Bitcoin, and we'll explain what that means.
Yes.
It's the equivalent now of the UAE and will soon be the equivalent of how much energy Pakistan uses.
Right, and it's slated to, so researchers at Cambridge University estimate that the electricity consumption of the Bitcoin network is almost 120 terawatt hours annually. That's more than the energy consumption of the UAE at 119.45 terawatt hours, and as you said, on course to overtake Pakistan. But proponents of Bitcoin argue this isn't a nuanced enough view of cryptocurrencies generally. And as we see from Tesla's earnings report this morning, which was largely pinned on Bitcoin, it's entering a mainstream, the likes of which we have not. It keeps reaching unprecedented heights. So today, I did really want to talk to you about mining into what is this hullabaloo about energy consumption and Bitcoin.
So the hypothesis is that the growing price of Bitcoin at around $60,000 per Bitcoin at the moment is fueling the activity of Bitcoin miners around the world, but a large number of them in China, for example. And if I can sort of describe what Bitcoin mining is, it's not mining in the traditional sense as people might have known it historically.
No, but we do often compare it to gold mining because it's a useful comparison. Off to go to a finite resource. The miners are not it's not the miners who get rich.
But in this case, they do.
Here we go.
Yeah, no, but in this case,
and we're off.
Yeah, no, but in this case, the Bitcoin miners do this for what is hopefully for them. And they have to strike it lucky. If I'm going to use the gold miners analogy, not every gold miner found gold, and many rushed. And in the various gold rushes, and this is not a history lesson here, but the various gold rushes, and bought equipment and went out there and panhandled and did all of that stuff, right?
Okay, so what did Satoshi build in 2008? What was the thing? What is Bitcoin? How is it mined?
I'll describe it in the most basic terms. Mining Bitcoin is like the equivalent of a computer game. It's a competition to process enough transactions, Bitcoin transactions, in the blockchain, essentially the place where you play the game, to then win a certain number of Bitcoins. And like any video game, your ability to play it, in this case, your computing power, gives you a greater chance of success. And that's why these Bitcoin mines, so to speak, they aren't the friendliest places to work. I mean, where the comparisons are to actual mines is that they are huge places where there are large amounts of servers generating that computer power to play that game as best as they can. And it's not necessarily the healthiest environment to work in. But the other side of it is that to power these servers, to power this compute as they call it, requires a lot of energy. And if you're somewhere like Iceland, where it's all geothermal energy, then it's sustainable or clean energy that you're using. But if you're somewhere else and you are drawing on huge amounts of coal-fired power, electricity derived from coal or oil or gas, which is better but not necessarily, completely green, and you're building on this to the point where you're the equivalent of another country, then the emissions from this, the effect on the environment, on global warming, is what has people up in arms. And I think before, I know you're going to jump in, but before, just to say that the difference between the drawing of energy for something like IT or the cloud or the internet in general is it benefits everyone. Where the Bitcoin mining benefits those people who successfully get the Bitcoin in that competition, in that video game that they are playing, and nobody else. That it's, the utmost, capitalistic competition, essentially.
Right. And it's a hunt for a finite resource. Satoshi, the anonymous creator of Bitcoin, it's encoded that Bitcoin would never exceed 21 million coins, which is the core technological breakthrough there, is that it's a finite source, and the only way to extract it is to prove that you've expended energy. So you actually trade compute energy for this value. And I think understanding that is core to understanding why it takes so much energy to extract, to mine. But I do think we also need to talk about, in order for Satoshi, he or she, to build a decentralized unit of digital value into the world, he or she, they could have done other things. Initial coin offerings, airdrops is another method that has been mentioned, and faucet models are another kind of gimmicky thing. But this idea of exchanging energy for value is core to Bitcoin, and it will never change. So this idea that we'll innovate our way out of the energy needed is incorrect, but the energy source is something that could perhaps be changed.
I think there's a broader discussion here about digitalization and technology and our changing ways of living. But just to come back to your point about Bitcoin, it's decentralized and it's robust. You can't manipulate it. And the reason why you can't manipulate it is because it takes huge amounts of computing power to dominate the blockchain, to be able to defraud people. So the idea was that, the original concept was, how do you build a peer-to-peer financial, form of exchange without a bank or someone sitting in the middle to guarantee that things are honest? You have to assume that everybody's out to defraud the system. And to make sure that the system remains robust and fair, then the majority of users make decisions, and the majority of users are unlikely to defraud themselves or other people. So that's why you need also increasing amounts of power, because the larger the number of people that get onto this network and want to be part of it, then the bigger the draw is. So it's to your point, it is absolutely right. This is the point of Bitcoin. It's not going to change. Unlike our producer Aisha Khan mentioned, Ethereum are planning to change the way Ether, their cryptocurrency, is mined, so to speak, to be more sustainable. But that is effectively a closed system. It's not the same as Bitcoin, which requires a majority of users, which is very, very hard to coagulate, a majority of users to make any real changes. Mm-hmm. So it's not a question of this bad publicity about Bitcoin to pressure any particular group or institution, even though there are a number of groups out there that claim to be, working on behalf of Bitcoin. It's nebulous. This isn't something that, if we shout out enough about it, that it is going to make a difference.
No, and interesting. What's been shouted out a few times is that Bill Gates told the New York Times last month that Bitcoin is the most energy intensive form of transaction known to mankind. Sure, but the idea now is, if it hits mainstream enough, it actually could accelerate a transition to renewable energy on a broader scale, that it actually is not a carbon footprint issue. It actually could be a renewable energy issue if we just reframe it.
Well, we have an urgent energy transition that we're in the middle of. And last week, the US President Joe Biden convened 40 global leaders online. He hosted it from the White House to talk about a new step change in meeting the Paris climate deal agreements to limit global warming to the 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that includes a massive, massive amount of investment in renewable energy, in sustainable energy, in clean energy, amongst many, many other things. So the kind of wider problem will solve essentially what is kind of headline grabbing. There's so much emotion about Bitcoin. It is loved and loathed and misunderstood and, invoked whenever people want to talk about the dark side of our new digital lives.
Sure. The thing about Bitcoin is it being stateless, it being wildly volatile, it being in its early days beholden to cyber hacking. It has a tough reputation to overcome, but its potential as a decentralizing, get rid of the gatekeepers force is incredibly exciting. And when you speak about renewable energy potential, Bitcoin itself could solve two problems that the renewable energy industry is facing right now. One is offload supply. So if you have excess supply, where does it go? It could go towards Bitcoin miners to exchange that for value. And then if you carry that further down the road, Bitcoin then potentially solves a battery issue, which is we haven't figured out really an efficient way to store solar or wind energy when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So you could potentially, energy companies have already done this, mine Bitcoin off to the side as a means of, storing value.
There's so much animosity towards the concept of Bitcoin, particularly from governments. And I'm a firm believer that it's because they don't understand it. And most regulators don't want anything to do with it. And, when forced to categorize it, they'll, for example, in the US, call it a commodity rather than a currency. They don't, and that's partly because then they don't have to deal with it as much as they would if they said it was actually a currency. And I think there's a race for central banks to be, whether it's China or elsewhere, the first central bank to issue their own digital currency, because they think that somehow the appetite for digital exchange, mediums of exchange, will kind of filter through to what they're doing. I think that what's happening with Bitcoin is an indicator of something much deeper and much more about how our lives are changing. And if you look at sort of more benign platforms like, again, to come back to the video games like Fortnite or Roblox that create worlds within worlds, and, even Minecraft, it's been around for years, they'll continue to draw more people and become more complex. And if you throw in virtual reality, augmented reality, and the worlds become deeper and richer and will have their own currencies, already have their own currencies, already have their own mediums of exchange, requires you to buy tools and equipment, then that will begin to draw power as well. So, but then there'll be so many of them that it's not just one villain, which is, Bitcoin miners. We need to come up with a solution to the increasing electricity that, again, to come back to the beginning, cloud computing or any kind of digital activity is requiring.
Right. The push to digitalize is a huge burden on our grid systems. But the push to decentralize, which is powering some of this migration to things like Bitcoin, is hugely exciting. I mean, to your point, but we are going to need currencies and products and things we haven't even imagined yet to seed these worlds and to make these worlds compelling places to be, both economically and socially, societally.
So are you saying that decentralizing the way we produce power is sort of following the Bitcoin model is a way to resolve a lot of these issues?
It's meta, but Max Webster, a energy Bitcoin entrepreneur who I read a lot of to prep for this episode, to be honest, talks a lot about the similarities between the financial and energy industries, both being in dire need of decentralization, of the removal of these opaque gatekeepers, and that renewable energy sources and Bitcoin could be two paths forward, and they have much in common. Bitcoin has really an original sin problem, which is that when it was created back in 2008 and continuing still today, we are a carbon-based, fossil fuel-based economy. And the exchange of energy for value when you're in that economy and desperately seeking to, meet your Paris climate agreement, become ESG, stakeholder capitalism oriented is, we've kind of got to rebuild Bitcoin as we're already careening along the highway. It's hit this mainstream focus. Tesla, Goldman Sachs, PayPal, all major names really giving credence to its validity. But with its energy consumption needs, it desperately needs a renewable energy story at this point. And so if Bitcoin can solve that, it potentially could really point the way forward for other, energy-intensive practices.
Kelsey Warner, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be here.
Thank you all for listening. All that remains to thank our production team, Arthur Edison and Aisha Khan. Once again, I'll ask you to subscribe to this podcast or any of the Nationals podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio content. Do join us again next time.